Good morning, everybody. Good morning. If I've not met you before, my name is Steve. I'm part of the lead team here at FCC. It's great to meet you, as it were, and good to have people joining us online as well today. We've just been asking that question here in the room and online. What was your first pet? So let's hear them. Rabbit. Tortoise. Cat, dog. Goldfish. Rat. Wow. Any more for any more? A parrot. A ferret. Brilliant. This is just a great range of animals, isn't it, here? Super. Budgie, I changed the name of this question in my prep because originally it was what was the name of your first pet, but I thought if this is going out online, I didn't want to give away the answer to your online banking security questions. We don't really want that online, do we? So my answer to this question is relevant to what we're going to be talking about today because it links to a time in life when I first encountered grief. In 1992 or 93, I think it was, Mum and Dad decided that it was time that me and my older brother were allowed to have our first pet, a pet hamster. So we were both allowed to have a pet hamster each. And we had recently been to watch the Disney blockbuster that was Aladdin at the cinema. And we decided to put the two and two together. And so when it came to naming our hamsters, my brother, who is older than me, he got first choice. So he went for Aladdin and I went for Jasmine. And so we had these two pet hamsters, Aladdin and Jasmine. What a time to be alive that was. Life was just easier back then in life. Now, when my experience of grief came when I was woken one morning by my dad to tell me that, sadly, he gently broke the news to me that there had been a fight. And sadly, Jasmine had come off worse and was no longer with us. I need to clarify, the fight wasn't between my dad and Jasmine, it was between, he wasn't just waking me up to say, anyway. There'd been a fight. And this was my first experience with grief as a young child. Now, over the years, we actually went on to lose more pets. Goldfish that didn't survive a tank cleaning. A rabbit that was taken too early by a fox. A canary that flew away. And my brother's guinea pig that succumbed to a cold winter's night. There is a reason I have no pets anymore. None of us are immune to grief. And I'm sure that we will have all experienced grief in some way. And I just want to make a bit of a disclaimer to this message today because, as I say, I'm going to be talking about grief, and I'm aware that that is a really difficult thing to perhaps hear about if maybe you're really journeying through grief at the moment. And so if you just need to check out of this message today in whatever way, then please do that. Jump onto Candy Crush or whatever it may be. I don't know, whatever you need to do. Is Candy Crush still a thing? I have no idea. It's a game, isn't it? But anyway, that's besides the point. If you need to check out in some way, then that's okay. Because like I say, I appreciate it is a really sensitive thing for us to be looking at and talking about today. But I do just want to say that I hope that by the end of this message today, that you will have hopefully found some hope from what I believe God wants to say to us today. Grief, as I said, it's something that we've likely all experienced at some point in our lives. It may be similar to my experience where, you lose a pet, but it could come through the death of a loved one. And we can experience it in so many other ways as well. It might be through a change in season in life. Perhaps your children have left home and you're grieving that season. You're feeling that loss. It could come through the loss of a job or perhaps certain decisions that have been taken out of your hands, like how and when you are able to start a family. It could be the grief of a diagnosis and you're suddenly experiencing a lot of change and a lot of loss in your life. It could be the loss of a significant relationship in your life. Natasha Smith, who is a grief counselor and has written a great book called Can You Just Sit With Me, she sums it up this way. She says, grief is a natural response to loss. And when we experience loss, the emotion that follows is grief. Grief is personal to us. It's not this kind of neat emotion that we can fit into a box. It doesn't respect our timelines. It doesn't respect our schedules. It's why you could perhaps, for example, find yourself totally confused when out of nowhere you suddenly burst into tears in the middle of the supermarket and you just don't know why, but something has triggered your response to loss in that moment. As a result of grief, you might cry. You might become angry. You might withdraw from people or be left just feeling empty. And none of those feelings are unusual or wrong. They're simply a natural response to loss. I wonder if you have ever felt those emotions in response to loss. Loss is an emotion that, as a United fan right now, I am all too familiar with. Today, the reason that we're talking about grief and about loss is because we are on part 11 of our Women of the Bible series. There's 2 more parts to come today and next week. And this week, we're going to be looking at 3 different women and the way that they all responded to loss. We're going to be looking at Naomi, at Orpah, and Ruth. I am married to a Ruth. I have a sister-in-law called Naomi, but I'm still yet to meet an Orpah. Anybody here called Orpah? No. It seems to be a name that for some reasons just disappeared, I think. But their story is recorded for us in a book of the Bible called Ruth. It's in the Old Testament of the Bible, and it's an incredible short story. And I actually think that it is essentially the story of God just in these 4 small chapters. And so we won't have time today to read through the whole book of Ruth. We're just going to look at Ruth chapter 1. But I'd encourage you this week, take some time. It takes about 20 minutes just to read through the book of Ruth. And we're going to look, as I said, at Ruth chapter 1. And we actually have a guest from the other side of the world who is going to be reading Ruth chapter 1 to us. If you've been around in our church for a few years, you may remember a young woman called Donna. And Donna went to be a missionary out in Papua New Guinea working for YWAM. And so we're going to hear now from Donna reading to us Ruth chapter 1. Thank you.
In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her 2 sons and her husband.
If you know the story of Ruth, you'll know that we're not done yet, so we're going to go back to Donna in a moment. But our story begins with those 4 characters. Elimelech and his wife Naomi, along with their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they had to leave their homeland. They were from a town, you may have heard of it, called Bethlehem, which was in Judah. And they had to go to a neighboring nation called Moab because of a severe famine in the land at the time. And sadly, what we read is that 4 soon becomes 1, as firstly Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, and then 10 years later, their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also die. We're not told what happened to them, but what we need to do is just enter into their society for a moment. It's very different to the society that we live in and the different support that you get in our welfare system here. And just for a moment, think about what life would have been like for Naomi. She was left alone with her two daughter-in-laws who were from Moab, this neighboring nation. She had no grandchildren. She is a widow who is grieving the loss of her husband and two sons. And so she is in a very desperate place. And as a trio, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth have experienced immense suffering. And at this time, as I said, on the planet that they lived on, our planet, to be a widow with no son to take care of you. And for Naomi, in a land that was not her own, left them all in a really vulnerable position in society. Are you with me so far? Good. Let's hear again from Donna and find out what happens next.
Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab and return to her homeland. With her two daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more.
So from our three kind of main characters of this week, our three women of the Bible, we see very different responses to loss. Another reminder for us that we are all different, and naturally we respond differently to loss. Now, I have to say at this point in this message, grief is a huge topic, and we of course won't be able to cover everything about grief today. And so what we're going to do in particular is just, like I say, focus on their three reactions and home in on, I think, one common aspect of the three of them, something that I think God wants to say to us today. But later on today, we're going to be sharing in an email some resources and support links to hopefully help if you are journeying through grief right now in some way, or maybe you're journeying alongside someone as well. And so these links and these resources will, I believe, help us to perhaps better understand and empathize with those who are experiencing loss. Three totally different responses to loss here. But I think one important lesson for us to take from these three women, and it's this, that grieving in community with God and his people can lead to hope. Grieving in community with God and his people can lead to hope. Naomi endured immense loss. First, it was her husband. Also, it had been, if you think about it, her home. As she left Bethlehem due to the famine, she left everything behind, forcing her to leave behind family, friends, community, culture, and all of the home comforts that she had known. And then she loses, 10 years later, her 2 sons. And then what we see is that hearing things have improved in Judah, in Bethlehem, she leaves behind this new community of friends that she'll have made, along with the place where she has experienced some really significant life events, including her son's weddings and the funerals of her husband and her sons. So Naomi has been through an incredible amount of loss. And we're told that she is feeling bitter and she is blaming God. That's a perfectly normal reaction to loss. And I don't know who maybe needs to hear this today, but I think God wants to say to us all that he's okay with our honesty. The Bible is actually full of examples of people who took their emotions to God, people who took their frustrations to him, their anger and their bitterness to God. We're told Jesus himself, in response to a significant loss of his good friend Lazarus, we're told he wept loudly. We see from Naomi in this passage an example of how easy it is, though, to let bitterness take hold of us when we're experiencing grief. Let's just watch one last clip from Donna here, who's going to tell us what happens next with Naomi. Thank you.
So the 2 of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?" So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring, at the beginning of the barley harvest.
So we see that Naomi let bitterness take root in her life, so much so that she went to the effort of changing her name, and she said to her community as she returned back to Bethlehem, "No, it's not Naomi, it's Mara." She changed her name to a name and a word that means bitterness. She is saying to her community, "I am bitter." Now, I hope that this doesn't in any way sound judgmental of Naomi. Actually, I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's great that she felt like she could be honest with her community, with her people, who could then, as we'll find throughout the book of Ruth, help her on this journey as she navigates loss. When I was 15, I lost my best friend to what was a sudden heart condition. And in the following 2 to 3 years, I can really relate to Naomi, because the way that I dealt with my grief was by allowing bitterness to gradually take hold and deepen within me. You know, that bitterness, it impacted my outlook on life. It strained my relationships with others and with God. And it made me actually a really difficult person to be around. Hebrews 12 verse 5, it's a book in the New Testament of the Bible, gives us really a stark warning about this emotion of bitterness. It says, "Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you and corrupting many." Becoming bitter for any reason, it can be poisonous if we let it grow out of control. Naomi had adopted this new name to reflect her bitterness. She was consumed by grief, and in her grief, she blamed God for her loss. But I think that as we look at Naomi's life and as we look at her story, she actually does something that I think shows us how to cut down that root of bitterness. Here's what she does, as Donna has just read for us. She returns to God and his community of people. At the beginning of Ruth chapter 1, hopefully you'll remember that she, along with her husband, had fled from Bethlehem because of a famine. But then what we see here is that she has decided to return back to Bethlehem. When she left Judah, she went to Moab, and Moab at this time was considered a godless nation, a nation that was full of worship of idols. And so for Naomi, she was living in a nation at the time with a group of people who didn't share her faith. She was lacking community with people that could support her with God's love and with God's care. After the death of her husband and her sons, as I just said, we're told she returns to Judah, where she finds herself surrounded by a loving and caring community. And we haven't got time to go into it today. Like I said, read Ruth chapters 1 to 4. It's such a short story, but in chapter 4, we see how that community is so significant in her life around her. The entire town of Bethlehem, we've just heard from Donna, was excited to see Naomi return. And it's likely that their support was a significant help to her as she continued to navigate her grief. I think Naomi shows us the importance of being real with our grief in a safe and loving community. In our times of grief, we need to be where God is, in communion with Him, talking with Him about our emotions, sharing with close and trusted people around us who can sit with us and can just listen to how we're feeling, to our emotions, and then who can pray with us and who can share words of courage and words of life with us. Over time, within the supportive community of God's people, including her daughter-in-law Ruth, who now shares this same faith as Naomi, Naomi gradually finds healing in her grief as she reconnects with God's community. Grieving in community with God and His people can lead to hope. Orpah, she's the second character that we read of in this story here. I think Orpah often faces some unfair criticism about how she responded to loss. She experienced significant trauma. We know because she married into a family from Judah that she'd left her family behind. So she'd already experienced some loss. And then at a young age, she loses her husband. Initially, she chose to follow Naomi and Ruth back to Bethlehem, but later she changes her mind and she decides to go back to her family, which I think is actually a really natural reaction and response to trauma, is this uncertainty. When we experience trauma of any kind, it leaves us feeling uncertain, and it affects our ability to make decisions. I wonder if anyone can relate to Orpah. I don't think her decision to eventually leave was about disloyalty, and if anything, Naomi had told her to leave and had told her to go back. I don't think there was necessarily a right or wrong choice here for Orpah. She simply made the best decision for what she felt was right for herself at the time, reflecting, I think, the unique ways that we all cope with loss. For Orpah, it could have perhaps been more painful to go on and continue with Naomi and Ruth, a painful reminder of her husband that she had lost. You know, sometimes in our seasons of loss, in our seasons of grief, people choose to move on from people and from places because the grief and the trauma is too painful. For some, healing then comes from a new community, if that is what is needed. We see in Orpah's life how hard it is to make those kinds of decisions when we are grieving. And we're not told exactly how Orpah came to this decision, but what we do see is that it was in conversation and it was in community with others who follow God. In times of grief, it really helps to stay close to God and in community with God's people as we seek and try to navigate the next direction for our lives. And we find that direction through the Word of God. We find it through prayer. We find it through community. We find it through seeking out professional help like a grief counselor. And we find it through trusting God for his direction for our lives. Grieving in community with God and his people can lead to hope. Now, like Orpah, Ruth, our third woman here of this story, she had experienced loss when she left her culture to marry a man from Bethlehem. And then again, like with Orpah, she loses her husband at a young age. Now, in her grief, we're told that she chooses to stay close to Naomi. And though the reasons are unclear for us as to why she chose to do that, perhaps she had a closer bond with Naomi. Maybe there was a lack of family support for her to go back to because, I don't know, maybe they disowned her for marrying into another culture. She might have been rejected by them. Perhaps it was a compassion that she felt for Naomi, or it was just this newfound faith that she had found in Naomi's God. It could have been perhaps many of those reasons. We're not sure. The reason is unclear. But what we know is that she chose to embrace this journey of a new faith and a new culture. And in Ruth 1:16, it said this is what Ruth said: "Wherever you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." In times of grief, with God, there is always a glimmer of hope. In our seasons of loss, when we journey with God, there is hope. For Ruth, this hope led her on a step of faith into a new beginning. She left behind everything that she had known. Having found this faith in God because of Naomi's faith, Ruth demonstrates that even in grief, we have to hold on tightly to hope. And again, like with Naomi and with Orpah, we stay reminded of our hope when we stay close to God and his community, even when it hurts and it's really hard. So often we'll want to isolate ourselves, to distance ourselves from people. But we stay reminded of hope when we stay connected in godly community and when we seek God's help and his courage as we journey towards whatever is next. We've sung a song this morning which quotes a verse from Scripture in Thessalonians. Paul, when he was writing to the church in Thessalonica, he talks about how we don't grieve as people without hope. If you are a follower of Jesus today, the great thing is that he is with us in every season of our lives. He's with us in the highs and he's with us in the lows. And it doesn't mean that verse from what Paul is saying, it doesn't mean that we don't grieve. It means we don't grieve as people who are without hope. There is hope in our seasons of loss. Jesus said in the Beatitudes, one of his most famous sermons, he said that God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. You see, the hope that we can have in a journey of grief and seasons of grief when we walk with God is that we can know his comfort. We can know his peace in unexplainable ways. It just doesn't make sense, but it's just this peace and it's this comfort that he brings us. If you read on throughout the book of Ruth, what we see is how Naomi and Ruth were blessed by God as they were real with people around them about their grief and as they collectively looked to God for his hope. We're all very different. Have you realized that? We're all very different. And we're all very different in how we journey through seasons of grief. Just like the examples of Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, 3 very different examples. And we have to respect how people grieve in different ways. And they might respond and react in ways that perhaps we wouldn't expect or are different to how we might respond. But as we look at these 3 amazing women, I think we see the importance of being real with our grief, of asking God to help us in our decision making, and of staying reminded of his hope. Grieving in community with God and his people can lead to hope. In my grief, when I was a teenager, I felt bitter and I felt isolated. I isolated myself from people. But at 18, I found a community of God's people where I could be honest about my hurt and about my pain. And this community, which was here at Foundry Community Church, this community helped me to navigate my grief and discover healing and hope. Because you see, being rooted in God and surrounded by godly community, it allows us to face seasons of grief with support, where there's hope and where you can find healing. What it doesn't do is it won't erase the pain, and it doesn't let you suddenly just bypass every stage of grief, but it provides a place to grieve with hope, the hope that comes from knowing Jesus. There's a word in that sentence that we've got on the screen: grieving in community with God and his people can lead to hope. And the reason why I say can, and I need to clarify this, is, grieving in community with God will always lead to hope. But sadly, sometimes people can be people. Community isn't always the healthiest thing. It isn't always the most hope-filled place. And so I stress, it can lead to hope. And so therefore the onus is on us, the church. It's on us, the people of God, to be a hope-filled community, to be a safe place for people to come with their grief as they navigate loss. And so 5 very simple, quick things that I believe we as a community can do. The first thing is stay informed. Stay informed. And later on, as I said, there's going to be an email. If you want to be part of our mailing list, you can let the team know at the Connect point. And this email is going to have lots of different resources for us to look at. But I just want to draw out one particular resource, which is this. It's a book called The Grief Journey by Care for the Family. I think this cost me about, there it is, the price is there, $7.99. It's honestly, it's a fantastic resource for us all just to learn something fresh and new about grief and how we as a church can help others as they grieve. And if you are in a season right now where you are experiencing loss and you have experienced loss, it's a really hope-filled resource. We can all do our part and stay informed. The second thing is stay connected and committed. Grief is a journey, and it's one that we will likely never graduate from. We can't be, as a church, we can be at times enthusiastic to help people around those initial days and those initial weeks. But the challenge, I think, for us as the church community is to stay the course with people. Check in over time. Check in around important dates. And if you're anything like me and you just forget those kinds of dates, use your phone, write them in the reminders app or in your calendar, and just check in with people. Stay connected and committed. The third thing is stay non-judgmental. Stay non-judgmental. People find it hard to talk about their emotions, especially with people who are quick to judge them for how they're feeling, especially when it comes to seasons of grief and loss. There can be all kinds of complex emotions. Don't judge. Listen, be empathetic, sit with people in their sadness. Silence is okay. Don't try to fill that void with noise or conversation. The fourth thing is stay in your lane. Number 4, stay in your lane. Some of us are great listeners. Some of us are not. Some of us know just the right thing to say at just the right time. Some of us don't. Some of us are good with paperwork. Some of us are good with logistics. Some are good with practicalities like fixing things or cooking meals. Work out how you can be the best help for somebody and stay in your lane. Your friends, they need you to be what you are good at and not to be unhelpful with things that you are not good at. And then the fifth and final thing, an easy thing that we can all do, is to stay prayerful. It's a simple, but it's a profound thing that we can all do for people as they are grieving. Just to simply say to somebody, I'm praying for you. Or to gently ask them, how could I be praying for you in this season? There's a verse that I just want to finish with, and it's from Psalm 34, verse 18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. And today, my hope for you, if you are in a season right now where you are navigating loss, first of all, it's to say, how can we as a church community help you? Let us know. And secondly, it's just to remind you of this truth, that today my prayer for you as I have journeyed through this message and been praying for our church community is to know that truth, that God is close to you as you are feeling brokenhearted. He's with you, and he's bringing his comfort for you today.